pregnant and mute, hidden in the apple cellar. A Lakota chief lifted the trapdoor door and stayed. The smell hit me first, not the apples. Apples I expected. Harlan Goss kept maybe 40 bushels down there by late October, big Jonathans mostly, the kind that bruise yellow and hold through winter. I'd bought from him 3 seasons running, traded dried buffalo tongue for a quarter of his cellar stock, and the smell was always the same going down those steps. Cold dirt and sugar rot and something faintly sharp like a turned cider barrel. What hit me when I lifted that door was different. Candle wax, down to nothing. Old wool, wet from the morning. And underneath those, something alive. The specific warmth of a body in a closed space. I stopped with the trapdoor at arm's length above me and let my eyes find the dark. She was in the far corner, behind the apple crates, sitting with her knees pulled up as far as they'd go, which wasn't far. A blanket over her shoulders the color of old creek mud, her eyes open and watching me the way a hawk watches from a fence post. Not afraid exactly, but absolutely still, calculating whether it needs to move. I said, in English, "Who are you?" "Nothing." I said it in Lakota. Same result. I tried a few words of Cheyenne, which is not my strongest tongue, and her face didn't shift at all. She wasn't deaf. I saw her register the sound, but she wasn't going to answer. I set the trapdoor easy against the frame and went down 4 steps and crouched, so I wasn't standing over her. The light came from the opening above, a gray October rectangle, enough to see. She was young, younger than I first read her. Maybe 22, maybe a few years more. It's someone as thin in the face the way she was, the cheek hollows that come from not eating right. Hair was dark and needed attention. She had a bruise along the left side of her jaw, old enough to be going yellow at the edges, and under that blanket, when she shifted to keep me in her sight, I could see the shape of her belly. 5 months, maybe 6. It was hard to say under the wool. I looked at her for what must have been a full minute without moving. She looked back. Then I said, "I'm not going to take you anywhere." I don't know what made me say that first. It's just what came out, because it was what seemed most true. Harlan Goss had sold his place 3 weeks back and ridden south for his sister's home in New Mexico. The new owner, a man named Aldrich, from back east somewhere, wasn't due until spring. This cellar belonged to nobody who was present. And whatever she was doing in it, she'd been here a while. The candle stubs, I could see 3 of them spent beside her, and there was a tin cup and an empty salt pork tin near her right knee. She watched me say it and said nothing back. I reached into my coat and took out the bundle I'd brought. 2 of the Jonathans I was going to take back with me, in a piece of deer hide, and set them on the dirt floor between us, and stood and went back up the steps. I didn't close the door, sat on the ground beside it, in the cold, and I thought, my name is Tokala Sapa. In English, some men call me Thomas, which I have never liked, but have stopped correcting because it costs more than it's worth. I am 51 years old, the head of our band for 11 years before the agency system came and made the word mean something different, something less than it used to. I have 2 daughters who are grown and gone to their own families. My wife, Winona, died of a chest sickness 4 winters back, and I have not remarried, which is my own business, and not anyone else's. I am not a man who sits beside a stranger's cellar in October and thinks for a long time. I am generally a man who decides and moves, but I sat there a while anyway. What I was thinking was not complicated. A woman alone, carrying a child, hiding in a root cellar in the foothills of the Bighorn Range with a bruise on her jaw and nothing but salt pork and candle stubs. That is a situation that arrived at its current state through some kind of violence. Not the weather. Not bad luck. Something that has hands. I had 2 horses with me, my roan and the pack animal. I had food enough for 4 days on the trail, and I was a day and a half from our winter camp. I had nothing that obligated me to this woman. Certainly no one would have expected me to feel obligated. I went back down. She hadn't touched the apples. She was in the same position, same stillness. Shh. The blanket had slipped off one shoulder and I could see she was wearing a calico dress. The kind sold at trading posts, too thin for October in these hills. There was a tear at the shoulder seam, badly mended with what looked like thread pulled from somewhere else on the garment. I sat down cross-legged on the dirt floor about 6 feet from her, and I said slowly and plainly, "Can you speak at all?" She shook her head once. Not a hesitation, not an uncertainty. A clean, practiced answer, the kind you give when you've been asked that question many times and have gotten the headshake down to something efficient. So that was that. No voice. No way to tell me anything unless I found some other way to ask. I pointed at the apple nearest her. "Eat that." She did. She picked it up and bit into it without looking away from me. Like she wasn't going to give me the satisfaction of watching her be hungry. She ate the whole thing, core and all, in maybe 6 bites. She ate the second one, slower, almost carefully. The way a person eats when they're starting to believe there might be more. I said, "I'm going to bring you some things. I'll be back before or dark. You can stay here." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. It wasn't gratitude and it wasn't suspicion, exactly. Turk. It was more like a woman deciding whether to bet on a horse she hasn't seen run. I went to my pack animal, and I pulled out the things I could spare without putting myself in trouble on the trail. Spare elk hide I used as a ground cloth, a piece of dried venison wrapped in cloth, a full water skin, a tin of matches. I took off my heavy outer coat and left it in a fold at the top of the cellar steps, then went down and set everything within her reach. She watched me arrange it without moving, to help. But her eyes followed my hands. When I straightened up, she reached out and touched the elk hide, just the tips of her fingers. Then she pulled her hand back. "I'll be back," I said. I rode out and came back 4 hours later, when the light was going purple over the ridge. I had 2 more water skins, a cook pot, cornmeal, a jar of rendered fat, coffee, and a wool blanket from my own gear. The good one, the one I'd been sleeping under. I also had, wrapped in a strip of trade cloth, a small beaded bag that had been Winona's. I don't know why I brought that. I didn't think about it. I just reached into my saddlebag and it was in my hand. I didn't bring it down to her. I kept it. But I noted it, because it told me something about the direction this was going. She had moved. The elk hide was spread on the dirt floor with the good wool blanket I'd left, before folded at one end like a pillow. The deer hide that had been around the apples was rolled and set to one side. The cook pot, she had no fire, course, was sitting in front of her, with a little water and some of the dried venison soaking in it, even though there was no way to cook it. As if she was doing what she could toward the idea of a meal. That did something to me. I'm not going to overstate it, but it did something. I built her a fire that night. There was a small stone ring out behind the old goss barn, used for rendering fat, and I got it going and brought the cook pot up and got the venison and meal into a proper state. She came up out of the cellar to sit beside it, wrapped in both blankets, and she ate out of the pot with a horn spoon I had in my kit, and I ate out of mine, and we sat there in the dark with the fire between us and the stars coming hard and cold over the byhorns. She pointed at me, then pointed at herself with a questioning look. "Tokalasapa," I said, and touched my own chest. She made a small motion like she was writing in the air. I shook my head. "I don't carry paper." She looked at the ground, found a stick in the dirt near the firelight, slowly, deliberate. Took me a moment to make out the letters, Margit. "Margit," I said. She nodded, made a gesture with her hand, rolling it forward like, "Go on, say it again and write." "Margit." She touched her chest once in a satisfied way. Scandinavian, I thought, from the name, or German. There was an immigrant settlement 40 miles east, a hard-year-old community of people from Norway and Sweden who were trying to make wheat happen in country that was not interested in wheat. I'd traded with 2 of their families the previous spring. She pointed at my chest again. "Tokala Sapa, it means black fox." She thought about that. Then she held up one finger and drew a small fox in the dirt beside her name, careful and quick, and pointed at it with a smile that appeared and disappeared. So fast I almost missed it. It changed her face completely. It made her look her actual age instead of the age that trouble had put on her. I didn't sleep in the cellar. I rolled out my ground cloth in the barn and slept there with the horses. And I lay on my back and looked at the dark ceiling of the goss barn and thought about what exactly I was doing. The answer I came to was not complicated. I was doing what needed to be done by the person who happened to be present. That was all. In the morning I would need to think farther ahead. In the morning she was already up when I came out of the barn, sitting on the ground, outside the cellar door, with a length of the trade cloth I'd left with her, working a knot in it with her fingers in a methodical way. She'd braided her hair back. She had color in her face that hadn't been there the night before. I made coffee and we drank it in the early cold, and I thought, out loud, while she listened, that is something she turned out to be very good at. Listening without giving anything away except the occasional small sign that she was following, I said. I have a winter camp a day and a half north. There are people there, maybe 30 families. I'm going to take you there. She looked at me steadily. You won't be the first white woman we've sheltered. There was a family came to us 7 years ago after the Rollins raid. They stayed 2 winters. That was true, though it wasn't the whole story. But the whole story wasn't needed. She picked up her stick and rode in the dirt. Why, I looked at that for a moment. Because you can't stay here. Aldrich comes in spring, and probably before that, some rider comes to check the property. And you can't go back to wherever it is you came from. I paused. That bruise didn't from a door. She looked at the bruise word, and then looked at the ridge line for a while. Then she wrote, husband. Your husband hit you. She put her fist flat against the dirt. An emphatic yes that didn't require anything more. And you ran. Flat fist again. How long have you been in that cellar? She drew 11 marks in the dirt. 11 days. 11 days on salt pork and candle stubs and whatever water she could gather from the eave drip when it rained. I stood up. I said, we'll leave when you're ready. Don't rush yourself. She stood up too, immediately, and went down into the cellar and came back up in under 2 minutes. With everything she owned in the world, the tin cup, the mended calico dress she had, on the blanket, and a small cloth sack that clinked in a way that said there were a few coins in it. She stood holding all of it and looked at me. So we left. The ride north was cold. I put her on my roan. It has a steadier gait than the pack animal, and a wider back. More comfortable for someone in her condition. And I walked alongside more often than I rode, which didn't bother me. I am not a man who needs to sit above others to feel right. She didn't hold the saddle horn. She rode with her hands loose and her back straight, watching everything as we moved through it. The draw of the creek bed, the aspen stands going yellow-white, a hawk circling over the south meadow. She watched the way a person watches who has not been permitted to be outside in a long time. We stopped at noon by a spring I knew, and I heated the last of the cornmeal mash over a quick fire. She ate methodically, the way she had eaten the night before. Not fast, but steadily, like she was determined to keep up. When I handed the coffee, she cupped it in both hands and held it against her chin for a moment before drinking. And that was one of those small things that I have not forgotten. The exact posture of it. The way the steam rose around her face. At one of the afternoon rests she found a stick and she wrote in the dirt. Is it far, camp? We'll see the fires tomorrow morning if the sky is clear. Do they speak? Lakota, mostly. Some Cheyenne. Most of the younger ones understand English, but won't always use it. She wrote, will they want me there? That was a fair question, and I took a moment to answer it right. My word carries weight in that camp, I said. Not as much as it used to, because the agency has its own ideas about whose word matters. But enough. I paused. Enough for this. She looked at me. For a moment. Measuring something. Then she erased what she'd written with the side of her foot and didn't write anything else. We rode on. We came into camp at mid-morning the second day, when the cook fires were still going, and the air was sharp with pine smoke, and the smell of the hide-stretching frames on the south edge. I rode in ahead, Margit behind me on the roan, pack animal behind her. People looked. Course they looked. That's the honest telling of it. A Lakota chief, riding in with a pregnant white woman on his horse, was not a commonplace sight, and I would not tell it any other way. My cousin Chongtechila came out from between the lodges with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular way it gets when he's decided to have an opinion, before he knows what's happening. He is 4 younger than me and has strong views on most things. Tokala, he said. Chongtechila, I said. He looked at Margit on the roan. Margit looked down at him with the same hawk stillness she'd given me in that cellar. Who is she? Chongtechila said in Lakota. She's going to be here a while, I said. She needs a lodge. She can share Hazel's. Hazel was an older widow, mixed blood woman who spoke both English and Lakota and had more floor space than most because her sons had gone to the agency school in the fall. Chongtechila knew this as well as I did. He made a sound in his throat that wasn't agreement but wasn't refusal either. He looked at me the way he has looked at me since we were boys. When I am doing something he thinks is complicated and might be right, and he doesn't to say so yet. She speaks? He said. No. Another look. She's not trouble, I said. The trouble is behind her, not in front. He uncrossed his arms. I'll talk to Hazel. Hazel Morningstar was a small woman with quick eyes and an abrupt way of speaking that some people found harsh and I had always found efficient. She came out to look at Margit, walked around her in a half circle, the way you look at a horse you're thinking of buying, and then said in English, "Can she cook?" I relayed this. Margit tilted her head and made a flattening gesture with one hand that meant so-so, more or less. Hazel snorted. She'll learn. And that was apparently that, because she gestured for Margit to follow her, and Margit looked at me once and then followed. I stood in the middle of camp with my 2 horses and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't quite named as tight. She stayed. That is the plain fact, though it unfolded one day at a time and was not always easy. She was in Hazel's lodge, and I came by each morning with the excuse of checking on Hazel, who was my responsibility as a widow in the band. That is the honest accounting. The excuse was real. The reason for the timing was Margit. We developed a language, the 2 of us, not formal. She didn't know Lakota, and I wasn't going to teach her fast enough, but a working language. Gestures, facial expressions, stick writing when there was dirt, or when I produced a page from the small account book I kept in my saddlebag. She had a quick mind. She could pantomime a full conversation, hands and face and posture together, and by the 3rd week I could follow most of it. What I learned about her: she had come over from Norway at 16 with her parents and a younger brother. The parents had both died in the 2nd winter. A rough one, the kind the plains hands out to the newcomers who haven't yet learned what cold means. Here, she and her brother had been taken in by a neighboring claim family named Halvorsen, and at 18 she had married one of the Halvorsen sons, a man named Eric, because that was what there was to do. She told me this in fragments over several mornings, her hands and the account book pages doing most of the work. What she didn't tell me directly about Eric, I understood from what was around the telling, the way she moved her hand when she wrote his name. Not quite a flinch, but close. The bruise on her jaw had fully faded by then, but there were others I'd noticed, older ones, thick scar at her hairline and one on her forearm below the sleeve. She had left him twice before. The first time he'd found her at the neighbor's house and brought her home. The second time she'd made it as far as the county seat and the sheriff there had returned her. A wife leaving her husband being, in that man's estimation, not a police matter. The third time, she hadn't gone for help. She'd just run, with nothing, in October and found a cellar. I didn't ask her what finally made the third time different from the other 2. It would have been a fool question. The answer was the child. She had made a decision about what kind of world she was going to raise a child in, and she was not going back on it. Toward the end of November, her belly had grown to the point where she moved differently. Slower in the mornings, sitting in a particular way when she was at the fire, one hand often resting on the curve of it, in an absent, habitual gesture. Hazel fussed over her in the way Hazel fusses over anything, which is brusquely and practically and without sentiment, seemed to suit Margit fine. One morning I came by and found Margit sitting at the lodge on the early light with a piece of buckskin in her lap, working a bone all through it in a small, regular pattern. She looked up when I came. She had learned by then that I came in the morning. And she tended to have something ready, coffee on the fire, or a piece of work she wanted to show me, or sometimes just a look when I came around the edge of the lodge that said she'd been wondering when I'd get there. I sat down beside her and looked at what she was doing. It was a small moccasin. She had 2 pieces of buckskin cut for it, the sole and the upper, and she was punching the holes for the joining seam. Tiny thing, I said. You know how to do that? She wobbled her hand. So. She pointed at Hazel's lodge, then mimed someone showing her. Hazel taught you. Nod. Working the morning was still enough that I could hear the awl going through the hide. Somewhere across camp, someone was splitting wood. She held up the finished piece, the sole and upper now joined with the beginning of the stitch, and looked at it with a critical eye. Then she looked at me. It's good, I said. She made a face that said, it's lopsided and you know it. The next one will be better. She looked at the moccasin for another moment, then set it on her knee with one hand flat over it, looked at me with something that was different from her usual hawkwatch expression. Quieter, more direct in a different way. She put her free hand on her belly, then pointed at the moccasin. Then she pointed at the space between us, at the camp, the lodge, fire, with a slow, deliberate motion sheen that I took to mean, here, all of this. Her hand made a small circle. Here, I looked at her. She held my gaze and nodded once. I understood what she was doing. She was telling me that she intended to have this child here, in this place, among these people, in whatever way she could make that real. Not that she'd decided, and was asking me to confirm it, that she'd already decided, and was simply telling me. That is its own kind of thing, to be told you are part of someone's plan, especially when no one made a formal announcement, and no terms were agreed, and she was just sitting in the morning light with a lopsided moccasin, and a look that said, this is how it is. All right, I said. She went back to her work. Chungtachila came to me in December, when the first serious snow had come and the camp had pulled inward the way it does in winter. Shorter days, longer fires, more talk. He came in the evening when I was at my own fire, with a piece of harness I was mending. He sat down across from me and said nothing for a while, which with Chungtachila means he's thought about something until it's ready. That woman, he said. Margit. The husband will come looking, down the harness. He doesn't know where she is. He knows she ran north. Those settler men ask around. They always find out eventually. This was true, and I had thought about it. Then we'll deal with it when it happens. He looked at the fire. There's agency trouble already this winter. Peterson at the office wants a reason to cause problems for us. Agent Peterson was a man of about 35 from some eastern state, newly appointed. The kind who came with the idea that the Lakota were a problem to be solved by paperwork and compliance. He had been looking for leverage on our band since he arrived because we had not sent the young men to the agency school and had not moved to the designated allotment sites. A white woman in camp is a reason, Chungtachila said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact stated plainly. I said, she is not going back to a man who beats her. He was quiet for a moment. That's not a question, I said. He looked at me for a long time, with the expression he gets when he is weighing 2 things against each other. Then, he said, you'd better be sure, then. I am. He picked up a stick and poked the fire with it, and said nothing else for a while. Then, Hazel says the baby might come early. Hazel's been wrong before. Not about babies. I went back to the harness. After a while, Chungtachila said, she's a strange one, that woman. How do you mean? She looked at me this morning when I walked past. Not afraid at all, just looked. He paused, like she was figuring me out. She does that. He almost smiled. Yeah, he said. I noticed. Eric Halverson came in January as Chang Taechila had said he would. He came with 2 other men. One I recognized as a claim holder from the Eastern Settlement, a man named Drust, and one I didn't know, younger, carrying himself like someone hired for the ride. They came from us since the afternoon, when the snow was hard-crusted, and the horses made a dry, ching sound across the meadow toward camp. I was outside when they came. Several others were too. Chang Taechila, 2 of the younger men, older woman named Falling Bird, who had every right to stand where she wanted, and did so. People came out of lodges and stood in the particular way the camp stands when strangers come in with a certain energy. I stepped forward because it was mine to do. Halverson was a large man, maybe 40 thick through the shoulders, with a week's beard and the kind of eyes that are always sized whether you're worth trouble. He pulled up his horse 10 feet from me and looked past me at the camp, in the way that men do when they've already decided what they're looking for. I'm looking for my wife, he said in English. Margit Halvorsen, she's here. This is our winter camp, I said. You're not welcome in it without an invitation. I'm not asking for an invitation. I'm asking for my wife. I looked at him for a moment. Tell me something. When she ran, how many times had she run before? His jaw moved. That's a private matter. How many? The younger man beside him shifted in his saddle. Drust was still watching me with the wary look of a man who is reconsidering whether he wants to be here. She's my wife under the law, Halverson said. I have rights. She doesn't want to go with you. That's not, and she's not going to. I kept my voice level. Not quiet in the way of backing down. Level in the way of a man who has made a decision and does not need to be loud about it. She's having a child in roughly 8 weeks if Hazel has it right. And she's going to have it here, and she's going to raise it here, and you are going to turn around and ride south. Halverson's face had gone red. He had the look of a man who has never had something like this said to him plainly by someone who meant it, and wasn't frightened of his answer. The law, he started. The law, I said, is an agency man in a warm office who wants my people's land. You go talk to him, see how that goes for you. Drust said quietly. Eric, just that. Halverson looked at me, then at the men behind me, then at the camp. He was calculating, the same way men calculate when they thought something would be easy, and it has turned out to be less so, I said. If you come back, I'll know before you get to the ridge, and you won't get any further than that. I said it the same way I'd said everything else. Not a threat shaped for theater. A fact. He sat on his horse for a long moment. Then he turned it around, and Drust turned with him, and the young hired man followed, and they went back south across the crusted meadow, and their horses made the dry crunching sound the whole way until they dropped below the ridge. Chang Taechila came to stand beside me. We watched the spot where the ridge cut the sky, he said quietly. He'll go to Peterson. Let him. Peterson will make trouble. Let him do that too. I turned from the ridge. We'll deal with it. I went to Hazel's lodge. I scratched at the entrance, and Hazel pulled the flap aside and looked at me with the particular look that means she knows exactly what has just happened. She heard, I said. She heard the horse noise. She knows something happened. Tell her they came. Tell her they're gone. Hazel nodded and dropped the flap. I stood outside in the cold for a moment. From inside I heard Hazel's voice, low and abrupt, saying the words in English. And then no sound for a moment. And then, once, a sound that was too soft to name, not quite a voice, just an exhale of breath, like a door swinging open that has been closed a long time. I went back to my fire. Peterson came in February, with a deputy and a piece of paper that said something about welfare of white women in Indian camps. I don't remember the exact language. I never gave it back to him. I met him at the edge of camp the same way I'd met Halverson, without theatrics. Chang Taechila was there, and Falling Bird, and several others. The deputy looked at the assembled group and shifted on his horse and didn't say anything, which was the right call. I told Peterson what I'd told Halvorsen, more or less. I added some things that were specific to Peterson, had to do with the fact that certain records he'd submitted to the territorial office about our band's movements and land use were factually correct, and that I had copies of the correct records, and that a number of people in the territorial government would find those corrections interesting. My lawyer in Cheyenne, a man named Aldous Birch, Winona's cousin by marriage, which had made him feel some obligation to our band's affairs, had been useful in assembling those copies. I watched Peterson absorb this. He said, "The law is clear on the matter of a man's wife. The law is also clear on misrepresentation to a territorial office," I said. "You pick which law you want to talk about." The deputy had definitely decided he didn't want to be there. Peterson looked at his paper. He looked at me. He looked at the camp. "I'll need to verify she is here voluntarily," he said. "I'll ask her." He blinked. Don't think he expected that. I went to Hazel's lodge and Margit came out with her coat on, the heavy one I'd gotten from a trader in November, and she stood in front of Peterson and the deputy, with her hands quiet at her sides, and her belly visible under the coat and her eyes doing the hawk thing. Peterson asked her, formally, if she was here of her own choice. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded, once, same as she'd answered me in that cellar when I asked if she could speak. Clean, practiced, without room for a different interpretation. Peterson looked at me. I said nothing. He turned his horse around and rode out, the deputy right behind him. Neither of them said anything else. Margit watched them go. Then she turned and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before exactly. Not the hawk watch, not the so-so hand, not the morning look, when I came around the lodge. Something plainer, something that went past the face. She lifted her hand and put it flat on my chest, just rested it there, over my coat, over the sternum, the kind of touch that doesn't ask for anything back. I put my hand over hers, just for a moment. Then she dropped her hand and went back inside. And I stood in the February cold, looking south at where Peterson's horse had left its tracks in the snow. The child came in early March, which Hazel said was all she's said to sit on time for all that she'd said about early. And Hazel delivered it with the competent efficiency she brings to everything. I was outside, through the whole of it, keeping the fire going, not because anyone needed me to, but because there was nowhere else I particularly wanted to be. It was a girl. Dark hair, loud, decided in her opinions from the first hour. Margit named her. She'd been writing names in the account book's back pages for weeks. I'd seen them and said nothing, and the name she chose was Winona. I found this out from Hazel, who said it the way she says most things, without ceremony or preamble, while handing me a cup of coffee. I sat with that for a while before I went in. When I went in, Margit was propped up against a folded blanket with the child on her chest. And she looked up at me when I came through the entrance. She looked the way people look after something enormous. Exhausted and very awake at the same time. She turned the child slightly so I could see the face. Winona Halvorsen, whatever she would eventually be. Small and red and clearly convinced she had something to say. Margit pointed at the child. Then she pointed at me. Then she looked at me with the plain look, the one past the face. I sat down on the edge of the sleeping robe. I said, "Winona." She nodded, watching me. There's a thing I've learned over 51 years, which is that most of what matters between people is not said. You can say a great deal and not get close to it. And then sometimes something wordless gets passed all the way in, and there's no particular way to describe it afterward, to a person who wasn't there. I reached over and put 2 fingers against the child's head. Gently, she made a sound. Margit made a small sound too, almost silent, and looked at me with wet eyes and didn't look away. I said, "She's good." Jit nodded. "You're good." She looked at me for a long time without nodding, which was its own kind of and spring came. The man Aldrich arrived to claim the Goss property as expected. He heard some version of the story from someone. These things travel, and rode up to our camp one afternoon in April to have a look. He was not what I expected. A quiet man, maybe 45, spent time in the mountain fur trade before turning to farming, and had, consequently, more sense than most. He sat at my fire and drank coffee and said very little. And what he said was worth hearing. He said, "Interesting bunch of people I've ended up neighboring." I said, "We're here," he said. "I know it. Means, there are things you know about this country that I don't." He paused. "I could use a neighbor who knows things." We talked for an hour. He left on reasonable terms and came back 2 weeks later with a question about the South Creek's flooding pattern, which I answered, and that was the start of something workable. Margit went to see the apple cellar in early April, when the ground had thawed enough to walk easily. She went with Winona. The child in a cradleboard Hazel had made, strapped to her back, and I went because she asked me to, a gesture at the door of the lodge and then south, which clearly meant she wanted company on the walk. We walked the 2 hours down without hurrying. The Goss place looked different in April. The barn unpainted and needing attention, the house showing the winter, but the apple trees along the south fence were budding, and the air smelled like mud and new green. She stood over the cellar door for a while. I stood beside her. Then she reached down and pulled it open and looked into the dark for a moment. The cold and the apple smell came up. She looked for maybe a minute, not moving. Then she let it fall closed and turned away. We walked back. Halfway back, she stopped on a low hill where you can see the Bighorn Ridge and the curve of the creek below and, if the air is clear, the smoke of camp on the north wind. She stopped and stood with Winona on her back and looked out at it all, and Todd beside her. She turned to me. Hand found mine and held it. Fingers through fingers. And she looked at me with something that had no useful language anywhere I know of. In Lakota, or English or any tongue I've been around. The kind of look that does not reduce. I held her hand. We stood on that hill for a while, with the spring coming up around us and the smoke of our camp on the air. That fall she asked me, in the account book, in her careful book letters, "Do you want to marry me or not?" It made me laugh, which startled her, because she'd been looking at me with a careful expression that was trying to be neutral, and I think she'd expected something more solemn. She stared at me laughing, and then something broke in her face, and she laughed too, without sound, her shoulders shaking and her eyes going bright. I wrote, under her question, yes. She looked at it, then she wrote, good, and that was that. I am not going to tell you that what Cafetier was simple. It wasn't. Peterson caused trouble the following winter, and Aldous Birch in Cheyenne was kept busy for 2 years with various papers and arguments. The Halverson man appeared one more time, drunk and with less backup than the first time, and that conversation was briefer and more definitive. What I am going to tell you is what is true. There is a morning, most mornings, actually, when I sit outside my lodge in the early light, before the camp is fully up, and I drink coffee and look north at the ridge and listen to the quiet. Winona is 3 now. She walks, she runs. She has opinions that she expresses loudly and without apology. She looks like her mother, in the jaw and the eyes, and she has learned already to watch people the way her mother watches. Direct, measuring, profound. And in these mornings before the camp noise starts, Margit comes out and sits beside me. She has a coffee cup she got from the trader at the spring exchange, white tin with a blue edge, and she sits with it the same way she sat that first fire, both hands cupped around it, chin down, the steam around her face. And she leans into my shoulder, easy and without ceremony, the way you lean into something that has held you before and will hold you again. Been a chief, and I have been a man the government tried to reduce to something manageable, and I have been a widower, and I have been a man standing beside a cellar door in October, trying to decide what he was going to do. I have been most of the things a man gets to be if he lives long enough. What I am now is the man she leans on, the man she picked. The man she wrote, "Do you want to marry me or not to," in an account book by firelight, because she had decided. That is not a small thing to be. I have the account book still. In the pack behind the lodge, wrapped in the piece of trade cloth, the pages where she wrote her name and drew the fox, and asked me a question. I don't look at it often. I don't need to. It's not something I forget. The coffee is good in the mornings. The lodge is quiet. Winona will be up soon with something to tell us that cannot wait. Margaret leans into my shoulder, and I put my arm around her, and we watch the light come. That's the whole of it.